It's Croctober, the official celebration of Crocs fans like you. So whether you like to rock your classic clogs, get cozy and fuss-lined, personalize with your favorite Jibbitz charms, or even, dress up like a clog for Halloween, it's time to tell your story and share your style. Join the Croctober celebration with Crocs fans around the world. Go to crocs.com to discover the range of shoes and find a pair that's iconic like you. Crocs, celebrating you all month long.
Hello, Quiet Rioters, and welcome back to another episode of Poll the Other One with me, Naomi. On our Sunday School edition last week, Alex and I got into the quality or otherwise of different American polling companies and their polls. And we've been inundated with listeners asking for more detail. You just do not seem to be able to get enough chat about what is really going on over the pond. Your wish is our command. Many of you will remember vividly that Trump outperformed polls in several states back in 2016. Pollsters have and continue to adjust their method, their assumptions, their algorithms to try and drive up accuracy. And to ensure their data is as representative as possible, they might only be interviewing 1,000 people in a country of many, many, many millions. So they'll adjust for age, income, previous voting behaviour, and much more to try and make sure that the data is as representative as it can be. And they also adjust for how they collect the data. So, for example, if the poll is a telephone poll rather than an internet-based one, they know that landline respondents are likely to be older, mobile respondents perhaps a bit younger, and calibrate accordingly. But polls cannot, by definition, account for very unexpected events. For example, we all know that bad weather can depress turnout, particularly of younger, less well-off voters who are time poor. And while a long-range weather forecast can be adjusted for, freak weather events can't. What if the swing state of Pennsylvania gets hit with a sudden early snowstorm, or Florida a fresh Category 5 hurricane? Well, the polls would almost certainly have underestimated Republican support in the former and Democrat in the latter, which is why neither party leaves anything to chance and encourages early voting. But this still doesn't mean all polls are rated equally. So today, we'll try to determine what makes one poll more trustworthy than another. And because we just cannot get enough of men called Luke on this show, following fresh in the footsteps of Luke Trill and Luke McGee, joining me to help you hear the signal from the noise, it's Luke Bailey, Head of Digital at iNews. Welcome, Luke.
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you for joining us. Before we get into the quality control side of things, where are we now as we go to record on Thursday afternoon, 24th of October? I think I saw a couple of fresh polls out this morning putting Trump ahead of Harris, one from Wall Street Journal on national lead, and another putting him ahead on which candidate voters most trust with the economy. That came out of University of Michigan Ross School of Business. But there was also a morning consult poll. Again, I'm not sure that's very highly rated as polling companies go, but it put Harris 4 points ahead. So it remains very confusing, doesn't it? What are you guys seeing? Because I know you track all of this.
The answer to this, and it has been the answer for probably about a month now, is that we're tied. We're tied in every meaningful way. We're tied in the swing states that matter. And nationally, while Harris has a slight lead, that lead pretty much matches the electoral college advantage that she has. So we're effectively tied there as well, which is not the most useful answer, but it's kind of really important with where we're at the moment. Like, it's very easy to kind of see, well, this poll says X and this poll says Y. And in reality, we're still kind of working within the margin of error.
That is deeply frustrating for those
Yes.
desperate to know what's actually going to happen. Of course, national lead doesn't really paint a huge picture for us because of the electoral college system. I'm going to assume our very highly educated and clever listeners know what the electoral college system is. So I'm not asking you to go over that. But what do we know about it in terms of how it can tend to bias one party over another?
There's definitely currently believed to be a bias for the Republican Party. We saw that in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by, 2.5 points and lost the election overall. Joe Biden won the popular vote by more, by 4.5, I think, in the end, and really just scraped an electoral college victory. He only won sort of 2 or 3 extra states that to kind of take him over the line. So overall, what happens is that Democrats tend to stack their votes up in highly populated states, California, New York, while Republicans tend to get more votes, more electoral college votes from the more efficient states, places like, Montana, Wyoming, really small states like that. And as a result, when you kind of wrap everything up, when you look at the swing states, Harris probably needs to lead by about 2.5 to 3 points. But there is one slight possibility that's kind of coming through in some of the data, and this is where we're getting into, it's a little bit crystal ball reading, but what seems to be the case in some polls is that lead that Democrats thought they had in very populated states like New York, some polls are indicating that's a little bit smaller, and similarly they're indicating that some states like Florida are actually much more Republican than we thought. There was a New York Times Siena poll, which is a really highly rated pollster, and they put Trump sort of 12, 14 points ahead. And that's way more. And what it suggests is that actually maybe that national advantage is slightly smaller than we think it is. Maybe there's a version of this in which Harris wins by 1.5 points, but actually is able to win the Electoral College because the way that various subgroups are moving is actually potentially good for her and good for the Electoral College advantage of the Democrats.
Well, certainly I hope that is true. You've mentioned quite a few individual states already. Let's talk about the really specific ones that anyone who cares about this stuff should be focusing on. Are there ones where Biden beat Trump in 2020, but were previously won by Trump back in 2016 that are of particular interest as we try and, as you say, look in our crystal ball on this?
Same 7 as last time. Anyone who stayed up, well, it wasn't so much staying up overnight, it was staying up for about 4 days in order to get the result in 2020. Well, remember, it's the key 7 states: Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. The kind of 3 key ones for Harris are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, what's known as the Rust Belt, but many people who live in that, we did not call it that, but kind of broadly speaking, northern ex-industrial states. Then there's kind of the 2 southwestern states, Arizona and Nevada, and then the 2 more southern states, North Carolina and Georgia.
About 18 million people have voted early, I think I read this morning.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about early voting in those states and whether it's as expected or giving us something to be worried about or hopeful for?
We know a little bit. I think with early voting, it's really important not to kind of grasp too firmly at any one thing or another. In 2020, Trump was very, very clear that he did not want any of his voters to do any early voting, as it was helped to rig the election, yada, yada, yada. This year, the Republicans are a little bit softer on that and are kind of more keen to get more votes in early. They're saying a win too big to rig, as they enjoyably call it. But what that means is that it's slightly hard to tell in terms of how it compares to last time, as we're expecting more Republicans to vote early. In terms of registration as well, that's shifted in the last few years. There are more Democrats used to have a registered voter advantage nationally. Then now it is about level. So that's a kind of a confounding factor there. And what you'll end up seeing is, we can dive into kind of particular areas and say, well, this area has some extra votes in, but we don't actually, and this area maybe less than what we think. What realistically we're looking at is we really can't tell. If there are indications, they will be comprehensive and across everything. And at the moment, we're getting some indications one way, some indications another. So it's really too soon to put. I know everyone wants an answer, and the answers to an awful lot of this is going to be not really sure.
Both sides are claiming stuff, that is for sure. You mentioned registered affiliation. Is that problematic? I mean, we know that there are quite a few moderate Republicans voting Harris, for instance. I think Nevada, we saw some new numbers earlier today. Republicans won early in-person voting again by 2-1, picking up 8,000 ballots. About 400,000 people have voted, and with mail, got statewide lead, almost 20,000 ballots, unheard of at any other point in the presidential cycle, tweets John Ralston at Ralston Reports. But then you get Marcus Swan saying in Nevada, huge percentages of people register independent because automatic registration at the DMV doesn't register you with a party, and there are more indie mail ballots than GOP in, say, Clark County. So it's really impossible to know. Does that tell us something more, or are we still very much in this who knows toss-up.
It's really a who knows toss-up situation. Like we can kind of read into that and say, okay, well, look, I think we are seeing something in Georgia. It does seem to be a bit different to what it was last time. But the reality, again, it's that thing of kind of, there's an enthusiasm gap. Are there going to be a lot of people who vote Trump early because they're very enthusiastic, but then that doesn't really carry through, and a lot of people eventually go, no, fine, I'm not enthusiastic about Harris, but I'll pull the lever for her anyway. So, which makes it really, really hard to kind of pick, particularly when it's as close as it is. Our current model puts Georgia as one of the slightly less close states. There's only a 1.6 points different, but when you look at things like Wisconsin, we're looking at less than a tenth of a point difference between the two. So when you look at this kind of these very close races, it's not going to be decided based on who gets early ballots or not.
I mean, 18 million is one hell of a sample. I mean, as someone who is pretty proud when I publish a 40,000 sample poll, which is, far beyond the average here in the UK, maybe that's it. Maybe it is such a great sample that, frankly, it is going to be as close as the polls seem to suggest.
This episode is brought to you by Financial Times. When it comes to voicing or acting on our opinions, why are some people more confident than others? With the Financial Times, you form your own opinions with conviction based on unbiased and trusted reporting. FT journalists tackle global issues with an impartial and rigorous mindset, providing the facts and analysis that you need to make up your own mind. Make up your own mind with Financial Times. Visit ft.com/the journal to read free articles and subscribe.
Quiet Riot. I've got another question for you then. If we can't glean much from the polls, are the betting markets more likely to be an accurate weather vane?
Historically, they were somewhat thought to be a better option, just because, if you have to put money on something, then maybe you're more likely to kind of really commit to
your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is that there are an awful lot of very wealthy people supporting Trump, and what seems to have happened particularly in the last few weeks, there's some reporting around about this. Wall Street Journal did some, and I think the New York Times did the other one, which broadly discovered that there are a bunch of whales putting extremely large bets on Trump on a bunch of the betting markets, which is shifting the overall numbers in favor of Trump, which is why the betting markets this time now we probably can't use anymore, which is a shame. We used to be able to.
Yeah, it is a shame. And I think that's probably happening here in the UK to an extent as well. Listeners will not forgive us if we don't get into the meat of this and really talk about the quality of polls. I believe you've got views on this. Do talk us through. How on earth do we trust one over another? Is the rating system itself flawed? Assume we know nothing. Tell us all of it.
The way that they're rated is on a bunch of different metrics. Some of those are historical performance, some of those are quality of like how they do things, and you kind of mentioned at the start, there's some of the different ways that people look at exactly how these things work. One of them is around probability panels and exactly how those polls are constructed. To get kind of probably too into the weeds about it, some polls go out and say, we have a random sample of 1,000 people, and we're now going to weight it correctly based on race and gender and party affiliation, all that sort of stuff. And others say, no, what we're going to do is we're going to reach out to try and find the right voters. We'll start by recruiting panel on male, because male now has much better response rates than some of the others. And then we'll have a much better quality sample in order to balance everything with. And that's a better way of doing it. The problem is we don't know exactly what the best way of doing this stuff is, because there are so many different options around, and it's now changing so fast. In 2020, there's some pollsters lent really heavily on landlines, and historically landlines were great, and they really performed really, really well. The problem last time around was that by the time it got towards November, the pandemic had become very ideologically polarized. Republicans were going out and living their lives. Democrats were staying at home and answering their landlines.
Phone, of course.
There was a poll that came out in Wisconsin that gave Biden a 17-point lead. He ended up taking it by less than a point. And the reason why is that the landline voters were pro-Biden by more than 30 points. So there's all this stuff that goes into this, and it makes it very, very hard to kind of assess between them. The best way to kind of watch the polls and look at the polls is to not worry too much about the individual polls. What you're really looking for is the trend. If a lot of polls are saying the same thing, so in the last 2 weeks, a lot of polls have been indicating a very slight tightening of the race, and so moving very slightly towards Trump, that's probably a good indication that the race is tightening, rather than saying this one poll has moved by 4 points. The averages are, broadly speaking, good. You can check the iNews average. Alternatively, the Silver Bulletin average, which is Nate Silver's, or the New York Times average, all of them are pretty good. I would put one minor asterisk on the 538 average, just because the guy who runs it is George Campbell. He used to be the Economist, and he's good. However, It's not the original 538 model that we're familiar with. And I think a lot of people haven't necessarily realized this. The 538 model that was very accurate in 2008 and 2012 and 2016 and 2020, so less so in 2016, but much more accurate than some of the other pollsters. That was run by Nate Silver. Nate Silver subsequently left and he took his model with him. So the 538 model is actually built from ground up, which not necessarily a problem, but when it was under Biden, they had to turn it off for about 6 weeks because as the polls started to get closer to more favorable for Trump, their model started to indicate more of a shift towards Biden. They weren't really sure why, so they had to scrub the whole thing and start again. So that 538 model that you might be very familiar with is actually not the same one that you've been used to. It's actually a silver bulletin now.
Well, that is fascinating because another thing I wanted to ask you about was poll convergence. For listeners that don't know what I mean, I'm not even sure I do myself, but basically some pollsters will potentially get panicked by their poll showing up something quite different. They won't want to be seen to be an outlier, and they might then do a kind of post algorithmic adjustment to bring them in line with where the other pollsters are placing their outcomes. Do you think that really does happen, Luke? And, is there kind of a groupthink mentality amongst some of the pollsters?
Good pollsters will publish their outliers. New York Times Siena poll, which is a really good one, has actually been doing this whole election cycle, and they have been publishing for some really quite surprising results. The more likely thing about convergence, though, is that people come up with similar models which could reproduce the same errors. So one of the big dichotomies in the polls this time around is what's known as recall weighting, which means that they are weighting according to the number of votes they had in the 2020 or 2016 elections. Now, logically, that feels like it might be a good way to do it. 2016 and 2020 both underrated Trump because there were a lot of hard-to-reach voters who came out for him, or at least that's how the theory goes. So what you do this time is you say, okay, fine. So we know that those Trump voters are hard to reach. So what we'll do in this time is we'll upweight them to account for that. The problem is that people tend to misrecall who they voted for. They tend to remember they voted for the winner, or they tend to remember that they voted for the more popular person. At the moment, that's maybe not Biden, but it might be. So that's a bit of a confounder there. But the question is that recall weighting actually working, or are you just recreating the conditions of the 2020 election? So again, if you look at some polls that if they weight by recall voting, it may say, okay, it's 2 points in favor of Trump. If they don't weight by recall, it's 2 points in favor of Harris. And this is one of these really, really challenging things where a lot of pollsters are coming up with the same models and reproducing potentially the same errors, or they may be producing the correct answer, and the people who aren't weighted by recall votes could be wrong. But we don't know, not going to know which one that is until
after the election.
Exactly.
Well, we'll have to get you back on to tell us where it all went wrong. Finally, I'd love to get on to message cut through. We all know that there are going to be a few 100,000 voters in a small number of swing states that are actually going to determine the result. What do we know about what might be cutting through message-wise? I saw a Guardian piece that said Harris and her campaign are not performing particularly well with the message that Trump is a threat to democracy. That's not particularly going down well with Republican voters. And I also saw a former Theresa May advisor turned JL Partners pollster James Johnson writing about the word weird, the label, now flipping from Trump to Harris. He says the Dems overreacted to Trump's McDonald's stunt that we've all seen the memes of going around the internet for the last few days. But actually, the average American voter found the stunt quite amusing. And Harris and Waltz are now just looking like they've lost their sense of humor. What's working, what isn't working with that very small handful of people? Or do we just not know because they're still genuinely undecided?
It's hard to know. I think generally for the election as a whole, the democracy under threat message has not really cut through, which maybe intuitively makes a little bit of sense because, well, ultimately, Donald Trump isn't president right now. So how much can democracy be under threat if he's not president? There's a certain amount of, well, this didn't happen last time, so logically it can't happen next time. Not sure we buy that, but that's that. You can see how voters kind of get to that point. The things that really cut through are economy, where Harris probably has maybe slightly behind, but certainly it's around the same level, and immigration, where she's definitely a little bit behind. At the same time, the real other thing that's cutting through, and one of the things that makes this election maybe hard to predict, and this is where I will give listeners the hope of the election. There is a colossal gender gap in right now, and it's almost entirely down to reproductive rights. If women care about reproductive rights, they're going to vote for Harris. And the indications are they care about it in very high numbers and in potentially could be turning out in a way that's unusual. That's what happened in 2022, which is the only post-Roe election that we've had in the US. And that was one of the first ones for a while to significantly underrate Democrats. And it seems to be over reproductive rights. So it is possible that there is going to be a very gender-specific wave, which will be very hard to predict, because if you're waiting to, for example, gender, and women are more likely to turn out than they ever have been before, then that's going to throw your models kind of off, and it's going to favor Harris. So if there is a way that kind of the Democrats come out of this with a stonking win, it will be because women have turned out in very high numbers.
Come on, girls, you can do it. Well, Luke, thank you so much. I mean, that is now it for Poll the Other One this time round. I think we're going to be increasing the frequency of these because there is just so much to chew over, even if it is not giving us a huge amount of clarity. I think just getting into the detail of the who, the what, the why is fascinating. Luke, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
We'll leave a link to your latest piece in the show notes. Listeners, go and check Luke out on socials. I think he's pretty active on Bluesky these days, as I know many of you are. Thank you for tuning in. As ever, drop us a line on Discord or via quietriotpod@gmail.com with any ideas you've got for future shows. But in the meantime, we live, laugh, love you, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita. Artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with SandStone Global.